Your Royal Highness, thank you very much indeed for inviting me to make a presentation to this fifth Wana Forum. I welcome the opportunity to do so on an issue that I think is of vital importance to the region. My delight at presenting to the forum is mitigated partly by the fact that I'm really frustrated that I can't be there in person, so I hope that this DVD will compensate for that. In this short presentation, I want to show why it is necessary to transcend the humanitarian and development divide, and how it is possible to place development policy at the heart of responses to forced displacement. The development impacts of humanitarian responses to forced migration are receiving increasing attention by international actors. Yet there is a persistent humanitarian development divide, which I would argue does not enable us to restore the dignity and well-being and livelihoods of refugees and IDPs. It doesn't enable us to generate sustainable responses to refugee crises. And I feel that it doesn't enable us to unlock protracted displacement, which is a characteristic not only of the Wana region, but of many refugee situations around the world. I want to make four very brief introductory remarks before I get on to the main presentation. The first of these is, as I've just mentioned, that almost 70% of the world's refugees and about the same number of internally displaced people are in protracted displacement. In Somalia, Iraq, and almost certainly in the case of Syria now, the three durable solutions are not working, and a positive way to address the situation of protracted displacement is to promote developmental responses, which are both more economically sustainable and better enable the protection and the dignity and the integrity of refugees and IDPs. Second point, I think we need to bear in mind that the cost of humanitarian assistance to refugees each year is something in the order of about $8.5 billion. That is just simply the humanitarian assistance from OECD countries. This humanitarian expenditure is largely devoted to emergency consequences of forced migration, and important and vital though they are to save people's lives, they sideline what I think should be a mainstream concern for development and economic impacts and opportunities, and how these are managed, and in a proactive and effective way, both for the humanitarian interests of refugees and their long-term needs, but also the hosts as well. The third point, I think, is that the humanitarian response is largely framed in the sense that refugees are seen as a burden on their host communities. And whilst this is indeed the case, there are a number of studies which are beginning to show how refugees can contribute very positively to the economic development of the countries in which they reside. A very significant study of Dadaab camp in Kenya, the largest refugee camp in the world, 3 years ago, showed how there were net positive contributions to the local economy. My own work in Cyprus has shown how a major disaster of conflict and displacement was turned to a development opportunity. And a longitudinal study in Tanzania, for example, well over a 10-year period, showed how the contribution of refugees and the development assistance around the refugee program benefited not just the refugees but the hosts. And finally, the situation is changing. The World Bank is working very actively in this field, and I've been contributing to that process. The Transitional Solutions Initiative of the UNDP, UNHCR and the World Bank have also begun to think through these challenges. The urban strategy of the Interagency Standing Committee 2 or 3 years ago, on which I was the lead consultant, focused very much on strategic objectives of restoring livelihoods and economic opportunities. The European Commission, in its regional protection and development programmes, currently I'm advising the European Commission on the development of a regional programme for the Syrian crisis in the Middle East, are a tool by which development opportunities are addressed. And the UN High-Level Dialogue on International Migration later this year will recognise migration and mobility as enabling factors for development. So there is an important context within which we can now begin to reframe refugee crises as development opportunities. I want to make 3 main points in this respect. What are development-led solutions? How can development and humanitarian tools and approaches address these challenges? First of all, we need to look at the macro and microeconomic stimulus and the ways that both refugees and hosts can be encouraged to develop livelihood strategies and contribute to the productive capacity of the countries in which they are hosted. Cash-based assistance is vital, promoting livelihood strategies, ensuring better coordination of needs assessment, enhancing community-based responses. All these demonstrate the ways in which refugees can contribute to their economy rather than being perpetually kept on assistance and humanitarian programs which do not best enable their livelihoods to be enhanced and developed. Housing, land and property are very important developmental resources. They're the leading sector of most economies, and it's important multiplier effects, upstream linkages to building materials, downstream to land markets and construction and employment. And for this reason, not least because refugees need housing, and many refugees in fact live in cities and urban areas rather than camps, developing ways of enhancing the housing, land and property sector of a host economy is a vital tool. It's also important to maximise the developmental potential of what I call localising production. The supply and purchase of materials, building materials, medical supply, food, tools, manufacturing equipment, consumer durables and so on, all these are part of a refugee household demand, and the more that these can be localised, the more that this will add to the productive capacity of the economy. Another critical aspect is obviously the impact on the public sector. And it is vital that plans for capital expenditure for infrastructure for both hosts and refugees are coordinated effectively. We need to tackle the externalities, the environmental costs, the depletion of water resources, which I know is a critical issue in Jordan at the moment. And we need to find ways of stimulating the productive capacity of the economy, particularly where there is a very large new demand. The 500,000 or so refugees in Jordan provide a very good example of that. And fiscal and taxation policies can expand investment and the productive capacity to respond to the demand that these refugees place on the host economy. The second aspect is to find ways of coordinating much more effectively what I call development-led strategies. This needs planning, it needs strategic policy making, and it needs institutional reform. It's vital that in national development plans and the national planning machinery integrate refugee impacts and the refugee developmental potential within the mainstream of the development programme for the country as a whole. Microeconomic growth targets matched by operational programmes and investment strategies to stimulate both the national and the local economy. Secondly, we need in this respect to look at fiscal planning and budgeting of line ministries. Some of the work that I've been doing with the World Bank in Jordan recently has been looking particularly at the main impacted sectors. Housing is one aspect, but mainly health and education, to try and establish what the fiscal stress of the Syrian refugees is on that economy and how the budget making process can better coordinate public expenditure and international donor support in that process. Many countries have poverty reduction strategy papers developed and enabled by the World Bank and the IMF. These are very important strategic vehicles which could also be used to address the development potential and impacts of refugees because they work very much to scale, and the important thing about them is that they address primarily obviously the needs of host communities, many of which live in chronic poverty and chronic conditions, but they can then be used to integrate refugee needs as well. It's vital that we look at, in the context particularly of public sector expenditure, the short and long run effects of the impacts of refugees and IDPs in some cases. The micro level impacts on housing markets, wage rates and so on tend to be negative, and they tend to be short run. It has an impact, the refugees have an impact on the quality of public services, for example. They depress wage levels and so on because they can compete very effectively in local labour markets. The macro effects on the productive capacity of the economy, on the other hand, tend to be long term. in creating more jobs, in bringing new demands, new skills for building materials, food, consumer durables and so on. So a key issue here is how the governments of these countries can manage these disequilibrium effects, and it's important that taxation policies, investment strategies are used to handle these impacts. Moving from the national level economic and fiscal planning machinery, another dimension which I think is absolutely critical is to ensure that urban spatial strategies, housing, land and property proposals and programs and the planning machinery address the impact of refugees, because the majority of refugees, as we know, now reside in urban areas or peri-urban areas rather than refugee camps. 2/3 of the refugees in Jordan, for example, are accommodated in cities, not in the main camps. So it's important that the planning machinery addresses the impacts that refugees have on local housing conditions, access to water resources, impact on infrastructure and so on. The fifth aspect, I think, is to consider procedural and regulatory reform. Very often refugees are prevented from working, their mobility is restricted in their host countries and so on. But it's quite clear that refugees have considerable entrepreneurial skill. They can effectively contribute to local economies without necessarily being highly competitive with local host capacities. But the importance here is to consider regulatory reform to enable refugees to perhaps have greater mobility within the country, to be able to take out licenses to work and so on. The benefits of these kind of strategies seem to me to be three or fourfold. First of all, livelihood support for forced migration is better integrated into long-term and more sustainable policies for the country as a whole. It enables more proactive investment and financial initiatives to be adopted that promote the development of the country. And I suppose also it is vital that we consider the ways in which some of the negative aspects, the externalities, can be mitigated and compensated for. In the paper that you have before you, I also discuss the significance of policies to address protracted displacement, since that is now a very characteristic phenomenon of many refugee situations, not least in the region with the Iraqi displacement of well over 10 years ago, and I think, as many experts assess, will be the same with the Syrian refugee crisis as well. So protracted displacement is not just a humanitarian challenge, it's a political and a developmental challenge. And not only are there needs to improve the protection machinery and the threats of removal and refoulement, detention and harassment for refugees, but also much more flexible policies towards mobility, subsequent migration strategies of refugees and so on, more flexible attitudes to cross-border movements, perhaps, and perhaps politically most contentious, more flexible policies on citizenship and integration. Responses such as these are very context-specific. The challenge lies, it seems to me, in overcoming some of the political resistance that many governments understandably have towards refugees, and beyond the immediate humanitarian obligations and commitments that they have. So concluding with perhaps 3 or 4 points, there are many possibilities, but there are many challenges. Can the political resistance of host governments to development strategies for refugees be overcome? Host governments must take the lead in development planning, but how might international humanitarian development actors best collaborate with and support this process? How can the main international humanitarian development actors better integrate their strategies and approaches if we're shifting from a focus on humanitarian responses of some of the UN agencies, particularly HCR, to the interests of the World Bank, for example, and other developmental donors? And how can international donors innovate emergency and developmental strategies? We need much more flexible funding of humanitarian intervention that encourage and enable humanitarian agencies to design and implement more sustainable and developmentally orientated programs. Your Highness, thank you very much indeed for the opportunity again to contribute to the Wana Forum. My only regret is that I can't be there to pick up some of the perhaps provocative and controversial ideas that I put before you, but I hope indeed they will be meet for a very engaging discussion subsequently. Thank you very much indeed.